You want to automate a repetitive task in Excel so that you can do the task again with a single click. The best way to do that? Record a macro. The macro recorder is the easiest way to create a new macro in Excel. A quick note. Macros aren't available in Office on a Windows RT PC. To see what version of Office 2013 you're running, click File, and then click Account. If you're on a Windows RT PC, you'll see Microsoft Office 2013 RT here. Now, before we get started, I want to make sure the Developer tab is available on the ribbon. That's where all of the macro commands are. I click the File tab, Options, Customize Ribbon, and over here I select Developer, and then click OK. Now I see the Developer tab. And here in the Code group are the Record Macro button and some other buttons I'll go over later. So let's get started. I'll record an autofill operation where I build a series of days based on typing Sunday in a cell. After I type Sunday, I right-click the cell and drag it to the right. As I move over here, the tooltips show what will go in each cell, all the way through Saturday. When I get over here, I release the right mouse button and click Fill Series. That's what we want to record, so I'll clear these cells and select A1. I'll repeat these steps, but this time I'll turn on the macro recorder. I click the Record Macro button. Let's name this macro Fill Days. Macro names can't contain spaces. I click OK to start the recorder. See how the Record Macro button turned to Stop Recording? When I'm done, I'll click that. We're done with our autofill, and since that's all we want to record, I'll click Stop Recording. Now I clear these filled cells to clean up the worksheet and select A1 again so we can test our macro. I'll click the Macros button to bring up the macro dialog box and click Run. Perfect so far. I'll clear these cells again, and this time I'll select a cell in a different column and row, C3, just to test the macro a little more. Watch what happens. The macro filled in A1 through G1. In other words, it failed. So why'd that happen? It happened because, by default, the macro recorder was using absolute references. Before I started recording, I should have turned on Use Relative References. By using relative references, the macro will build a series by selecting the active cell and 6 cells to its right, instead of building a series using A1 through G1. Well, I know I need to record a new macro, so I'll clear these cells and turn on Use Relative References. Just to change things up a bit, let's start at cell B5. So I click Record Macro, give it a new name, Fill Days Relative, and click OK to start recording. I'll type Sunday, do my autofill, and stop recording. Now I'll clear these cells and I'll switch to cell C7 and run my macro from there. This time I choose Fill Days Relative and Run. And now it works perfectly. So you can see that the relative references setting can be very important. In the next video, we'll rewrite the Fill Days Relative macro manually in an Excel tool called the Visual Basic Editor, so that it'll do something a little bit different. In the first video, we saw how to record a macro and how and why to turn on relative references so the macro behaves the way we want. Let's pick up where we left off with our macro, fill days relative, which enters the days of the week in cells across a row. We'll change it so it enters the days as numbers instead of names, and arrange them vertically in a column instead of horizontally in a row. We could record a new macro or build off of this one by editing it manually. Let's edit the macro to see what its instructions look like. Click the Macro button. Here's the last macro I recorded, fill days relative. Select it, and then click Edit. This opens the macro in a special text editor called the Visual Basic Editor. Visual Basic is the programming language that macros are recorded in. You can also create macros from scratch in this editor, which is doing honest-to-goodness programming. Here's the macro. It's called a sub, or subroutine, and its name, fill days relative, is followed by a pair of parentheses. I'll select all of this text, starting with sub and ending with end sub, and copy it by pressing Ctrl-C. I'll click here at the end, press Enter, and then paste what I just copied. Let's rename the original macro, fill days relative R, for rows, and rename the copy, fill days relative C, for columns, since these two macros can't have the same name. I'm going to change the instructions in this copy of the macro, fill days relative C. The first thing we need to change is the first instruction. Active cell dot formula R1 C1 equals Sunday. We'll change the day name to the number 1. The next thing we'll do is in the autofill designation. Change A1 through G1, which is going across the row, to A1 through A7, which goes down the A column. Change it in 2 places, here and also here. Those are just a couple of minor changes, but they'll change the behavior of the macro. I'll close the Visual Basic Editor by clicking this X in the red box, and that'll save my changes. And now if I click Macros, I have 3 macros, and here's fill days relative C, which is the new macro that'll behave a little differently. I'll run it, and you can see that instead of entering Sunday, Monday, and so on, across row 1, it enters the numbers 1 through 7 down column A. All that just from a couple of minor changes that we made in the macro editor. In the next video, we'll save your macro to your personal Excel workbook so that you can use it anytime with any workbook on your computer. Now I want to make sure our macro is always available on this computer. I can do this by saving it to my personal macro workbook, which is a special hidden workbook that loads every time you start Excel. I start the macro recorder and give this macro the same name as our original macro, fill days relative R. But this time, under Store Macro In, I choose Personal Macro Workbook and click OK. Just as quickly, I'll stop the recording because I didn't really need to record the steps, because I'm just going to copy over them. I bring up the Macros dialog box, and now you can see the macros I have. And here's the macro I just recorded in my personal macro workbook. And here's the macro that I want to copy. I click Edit, which brings up the Visual Basic Editor. And this is the macro, sub fill days relative R. So we'll select all of it, including end sub, copy it, and then close the Visual Basic Editor. And now I'll select the macro in my personal workbook that I want to edit. But Excel says that the workbook is a hidden workbook and we can't edit a macro. So click OK and cancel. Now we'll unhide the personal workbook. To do that, click the View tab and then click Unhide. Here's the hidden workbook, so click OK. Click the Developer tab, click Macros, and select the macro in the personal workbook. I click Edit, and here are the limited instructions that we recorded. I'll just paste over them. Now I just close the Visual Basic Editor, which saves the changes. The last thing I want to do is clean up, so I'll hide the personal.xlsb file, the hidden workbook. Click the View tab, switch the window to the personal workbook, and click Hide. From now on, when I work on this computer, whether I open an existing workbook or create a new one, that macro in the personal workbook is always available. The next time I shut down Excel, it'll ask me if I want to save the changes to the personal workbook. Since I want to save this macro to my personal workbook, I'll click Save. In the next and final video, I'll show you how to assign a button to a macro, so it's just one click away. In this final video, we'll hook the macro up with a button and make it available in two places. In a custom group on the ribbon that I'll create on the Developer tab that I'll call My Macros, and up here on the Quick Access toolbar. First, I'll create a custom group for the Developer tab. I click the File tab, Options, Customize Ribbon, and then I make sure Developer is checked. I click New Group, and here's our new group. I click Rename, and call it My Macros. Now let's find the macro and add it to this custom group. I go over here and choose Commands from Macros. I select the Fill Days Relative R macro that's stored in my personal workbook and click Add. Here it is. It's now in the group and I want to rename it. I click Rename and call this Fill Days. You can have spaces and display names. While I'm at it, I'll replace its rather cryptic icon with this icon that looks a little bit like a calendar. I click OK, click OK again, and here's my macro button in my custom My Macro group. I click it, and it works. Now I'll show you how to add the same macro to the Quick Access toolbar, so it'll be up here next to Redo. Click File, Options, and this time click Quick Access Toolbar. Again, I choose Commands from Macros, and here's the macro in my personal workbook. Click Add. To rename it, click Modify, call it Fill Days, and choose the same grid icon. I click OK, and click OK again. Now here it is, up on the Quick Access toolbar. I click it, and of course it works great again. Now you've got a pretty good idea about how to implement macros in Excel. Of course, there's always more to learn. So check out the course summary at the end, and best of all, explore Excel 2013 on your own.